Just because the principal bought himself a brand new Jaguar, he had to park it front and center on campus, in the most conspicuous spot possible, like he was afraid someone might miss it. That kind of showboating had already rubbed the students the wrong way. That night, a few students snuck onto campus and set up a prank right where the principal always parked. They were about to leave when a teacher suddenly appeared. Charlie and George happened to be passing by, and to cover for the others, they deliberately stayed behind. The next morning, the principal strutted out and parked his car as usual, basking in the attention. But just as the whole school was watching, the campus loudspeaker suddenly started playing a recording that mocked the principal for being a brown-nosing suck-up. Then a yellow balloon slowly rose into the air, and the whole place burst out laughing. The principal was completely humiliated. He immediately ordered a full investigation. Charlie and George, as the only witnesses, were called into his office. The principal didn't actually care about finding the mastermind. He just needed someone willing to squeal. George came from a wealthy family. His father was a major donor to the school, so the principal didn't dare pressure him too hard. After a few token questions, he let George go. Charlie was a different story. He came from a modest background and only got into this elite private school on 2 scholarships. The principal dangled the carrot of a guaranteed spot at a top university in front of him, while also threatening to pull his scholarships and even expel him if he didn't name the ringleader before the holiday break. Torn between his future and his principles, Charlie was stuck in a bind. But even after leaving the office, he never uttered a single name. To scrape together enough money for a bus ticket home for Christmas, Charlie took on a side job, looking after a retired military officer. The first time they met, the guy gave him a rude awakening. In a dimly lit room, an old man sat alone in the corner. He knew someone had walked in just from the sound of footsteps. Before Charlie could even say a word, the man tore into him and cursed him out the door. Charlie was ready to bail on the spot, but the hiring agent told him that nobody else was willing to take this job. So for the money, Charlie gritted his teeth and stayed. The next day, he showed up at the old man's place again. The man's name was Frank, a retired lieutenant colonel. Though blind, he still carried himself with military pride. He refused help walking and wouldn't tolerate anyone pitying him because of his blindness. While packing his things, Charlie noticed a neatly arranged uniform and medals in the closet. That's when he realized that this grumpy old man had once had a glorious past. Suddenly, Frank announced they were leaving for New York, right then and there. Charlie didn't even have time to say no before he was dragged onto a plane. On the way, Frank showed off a mind-blowing skill. Just by smelling the air and catching a few words of conversation, he accurately identified the flight attendant's perfume, where she was from, and even nailed her personality. Charlie was floored. Frank told him that after losing his sight, he had to rely on smell and hearing to perceive the world all over again. Sometimes, he said, a person's scent is more honest than their eyes. Once they landed in New York, Frank went all out, checking into the Waldorf Astoria, booking the best restaurant, and ordering the most expensive steak and wine. Charlie, though, couldn't focus. He was worried about what was waiting for him back at school, and even more about the disciplinary action looming after the holiday. Frank quickly figured out what was eating him. He cut straight to the chase and asked Charlie if someone was trying to use his future to pressure him into doing something against his conscience. Charlie didn't answer. His silence said everything. After dinner, Charlie tried to head back to school, only to find there was no return flight. It turned out Frank had lied to him from the very beginning. Charlie finally snapped and demanded to know why Frank had tricked him into coming to New York. Frank calmly laid out his real plan. He wanted to stay in the best hotel, have one last perfect meal, see his family one final time, and spend a beautiful night with a beautiful woman. After that, he'd go back to his hotel room and end his life with a pistol. Charlie was stunned. This trip wasn't a vacation. It was a carefully orchestrated farewell tour. For Frank, blindness wasn't the scary part. What terrified him was losing his dignity and becoming dependent on others just to get by. A once proud officer who now needed someone to guide him out the door. That kind of life made him wonder why he should even bother. That night, Charlie realized for the first time that this job was way more than he'd bargained for. He wasn't just looking after a grumpy old man. He was trying to stop someone who had already made up his mind to die. And this brief trip to New York was quietly changing both of their lives. The next morning, Frank put on his crisply pressed uniform and took Charlie to his brother's house. Charlie thought it was going to be a warm family gathering, but as soon as they walked in, he could tell the vibe wasn't right. Frank was as sharp-tongued as ever, needling everyone he met. With his keen sense of smell and hearing, he called out the hidden emotions each person was trying to hide. All their carefully maintained facades were completely useless around him. The tension at the dinner table kept building. Finally, Frank's nephew had had enough and publicly dragged up the one thing Frank never wanted to talk about. Turns out Frank had once been on track for a higher rank, but a drunken training accident caused him to mishandle a grenade. which cost him his eyesight and abruptly ended his military career. Face to face with his nephew's insult, Frank didn't argue. As they were leaving, he quietly said to his brother, "I always mess things up." After leaving his brother's house, the two went back to the hotel. The next morning, Charlie heard the clink of metal from Frank's room. He pushed the door open and saw Frank assembling a pistol with practiced ease. In less than a minute, the gun was fully reassembled. Charlie grabbed the magazine thinking that would keep him safe. But Frank calmly ejected the last round from the chamber and told him that the most dangerous one is always the bullet everyone overlooks. That's when Charlie realized Frank was truly ready to end it. To stall him, Charlie stuck with Frank to finish out the rest of his itinerary. At a fancy restaurant, Frank suddenly caught a faint scent in the air. A young woman was sitting alone, waiting for her date. Frank walked over and struck up a conversation. No pickup lines, no creepiness, just wit and charm that quickly put her at ease. He correctly named the soap and perfume she used and told her she must look beautiful today. The girl laughed in surprise. As they talked, Frank learned she'd always wanted to learn the tango, but never had the chance. So he held out his hand. The girl was nervous, worried she'd mess up. Frank smiled and said, "Tango is like life. It's not about not making mistakes. It's about keeping going even after you do." The music started playing. The blind old man led the girl onto the dance floor. 1 step, 2 steps, turn, spin. Every move was smooth and elegant, as if he'd never lost his sight. The whole restaurant gradually fell silent, all eyes on them. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause. No one could believe the man was blind. The girl reluctantly said goodbye, and Frank just smiled and wished her well, without a trace of clinging. That night, he checked off his last wish. But the next morning, he fell silent again. Charlie could tell Frank hadn't really let go of the idea of dying. To cheer him up, they went to a Ferrari dealership. Frank ran his hand over the car's body and finally cracked a smile. Charlie bribed a salesman and asked for a test drive. Even crazier, he handed the wheel to Frank. A blind man behind the wheel, the engine roared, and the car shot forward. Charlie kept calling out directions, but Frank drove faster and faster. The wind whipped past them as they both burst out laughing. The joyride only ended when the cops pulled them over. When the officer approached, Frank stayed perfectly calm. After seeing his retired officer's ID, the cop let them off with a warning. Those few minutes were the happiest Frank had felt since losing his sight. But happiness, as always, was short-lived. Back at the hotel, Frank sent Charlie away again. By the time Charlie sensed something was wrong and rushed back, Frank was already in full uniform. Loading the pistol, he slowly raised the gun. Charlie didn't run. He walked toward him step by step. Frank aimed the gun and ordered him to leave, but Charlie didn't move. He told Frank that if he pulled the trigger today, he wouldn't leave either. They stood there for a long time. Frank kept shouting that he had no future, no hope. Charlie told him that a man who could dance the tango, drive a Ferrari, treat others with respect, and live with such passion had no reason to throw it all away. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Frank lowered the gun. That was the moment their relationship truly changed. At first, Charlie was the one looking after Frank. Now he was the one pulling him back from the edge. The next day, they returned to school together. But waiting for Charlie was the hearing he couldn't escape. Back on campus, Charlie barely had time to breathe before he was summoned to the disciplinary hearing. The auditorium was packed. The principal sat at the center of the head table. He had one goal today: force Charlie to name the students behind the prank. George was there too. Unlike Charlie, his father had come in person to back him up. Charlie, as always, stood alone. When the hearing started, the principal questioned George first. At first, George insisted it was too dark and he hadn't seen anything clearly. But his father kept pressuring him with glances, and the principal kept pushing. Eventually, George caved. He vaguely named a few students, but never gave a firm identification. The principal wasn't satisfied and turned to Charlie. One word from Charlie, and it would all be over. Not only would he keep his scholarships, he might even get a recommendation to a better university. The auditorium went dead silent. Everyone was waiting for Charlie to speak. But after a long pause, Charlie shook his head. He still refused to name anyone. The principal was furious. In his eyes, George might have hesitated, but at least he cooperated. Charlie's refusal was obstruction, plain and simple, a violation of school rules. So he announced on the spot that Charlie would lose all his benefits and be expelled. Just then, the auditorium doors swung open. Frank walked in, dressed sharply in his uniform, as everyone turned to stare. He took a seat next to Charlie and calmly said, "Today I'm here representing his family." The principal was taken aback, but allowed him to speak. What he didn't expect was that Frank's few minutes of speaking would flip the entire hearing on its head. Frank stood up, scanned the room, and aimed his words straight at the principal. He said this place was supposed to be training future leaders, but instead it was teaching students to sell out their friends and abandon their principles for personal gain. That kind of education wasn't producing leaders, it was producing cowards. The principal tried to cut him off, but Frank shut him down in one sentence. He told everyone he'd seen too much war in his youth. He'd seen soldiers lose legs, lose arms. Those wounds could heal, but what couldn't be fixed was a broken soul. If a man sold his conscience for his future, even the brightest path ahead would leave him hollow. Then he put his hand on Charlie's shoulder. He said this young man could have traded one sentence for his entire future. But even at the last moment, he didn't sell out anyone for personal gain. Maybe some thought he was stubborn. Maybe some thought he wasn't smart. But that was exactly why he deserved respect. True courage isn't doing the right thing when it's easy. It's holding on to your principles when you have everything to lose. The auditorium was completely silent. No applause, no whispers. Because everyone knew Frank wasn't just talking about Charlie. He was talking about every single person in that room. The principal tried to argue further, but the committee had already started deliberating again. In the end, the school reversed all disciplinary action against Charlie. The students involved in the prank got their due punishments, while George received neither reward nor penalty. As for the principal, no one openly called him out, but everyone knew who the real loser of that hearing was. When it was over, the entire auditorium rose to their feet in applause. Not for winning, but for standing firm. Charlie kept his education and held on to his principles. As they walked out, a young female teacher approached Frank to express her admiration. Frank just caught a whiff of her perfume, smiled and asked, "Are you married?" That one line made them both laugh. In that moment, the old man who'd once been ready to die had finally found something to look forward to again. When it was time to say goodbye, Frank walked Charlie to his ride. He didn't say much, just clapped him on the shoulder and told him to come by for Christmas. Charlie smiled and said yes. The car pulled away slowly. Their brief encounter, just a few days, had come to an end. Life is like the tango. It's not about mistakes, it's about dancing on. Maybe that's the real message behind Scent of a Woman.